She sensed it the way you sense a fire go out in the room beside yours. Not with sound. Not with warning. Just the sudden, complete absence of warmth where warmth had always been, like a door closing in the dark. You don't hear it. You don't see it. You simply know, in the most animal part of yourself, that something is over. Alexandra was in the records room when it happened, 2 floors below the great ceremony hall of Castle Kingsley, surrounded by the smell of old parchment and candle tallow, ink still drying on the edges of her fingers from the morning's ledger work, the ceremony music drifting down through the stone ceiling above her, stringed instruments, formal and precise, the kind played only when the Alpha King himself was presiding over something significant. She had told herself all morning that she was fine. She had told herself that for 11 months, actually. 11 months of midnight conversations about small things that quietly grew into large ones. 11 months of a bond forming in the space between 2 people who were never supposed to find each other. A records keeper with no pack name and no known bloodline, and the most powerful wolf in the Embervale territories. She had told herself, every single day, that what existed between them was not a promise. That hope was a luxury she could not afford. That she had survived her whole life without certainty, and she could survive this too. She had almost believed it. The bond shifted on a Tuesday evening, just after 7, while the autumn rain came down outside the high castle windows, and 400 wolves applauded in the hall above. It didn't break, though that would have been one kind of pain. Sharp, complete, the clean snap of something ending. What it did was worse. It pulled sideways. Bradford's warmth, the warmth she had carried beside her own for nearly a year, the warmth she had tried so hard to stop depending on, flowed in a direction that was not hers, moved toward someone else with the specificity of intention, with the permanence of a mark. Alexandra set her pen down. The ledger was still open. The ink on the last entry was still wet. The ceremonial music continued above her, swelling into something triumphant, while she sat in the stillness of a room no one thought to look for her in, and absorbed the blow with the practiced composure of someone who had been absorbing blows their entire life, and had learned, long ago, that making noise about it only made things harder. Or she did not cry. She did not run. She sat still for a long moment, in the way that people sit still when the thing they always feared has finally arrived, and they are deciding, quietly and alone, who they are going to be on the other side of it. Then she stood, folded her work with careful hands, reached for her coat on the hook beside the door, pulled it on. She did not look around the room. She did not allow herself a single backwards glance at the space that had held 11 months of something real. She walked out through the servants' passage with her spine straight and her face composed, and the bond in her chest pulled sideways and sideways and sideways, like a compass that had lost north. 3 floors above her, in the silence after the applause, Bradford Kingsley stood on the dais with Celestine Silvercrest's wrist in his hands, and the hollow, terrible knowledge was already settling into his chest like cold water. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. Hey, before we go any further, I need to check on you for a second. How are you feeling right now? Because stories like this, they hit deep, and I want you right here with me as it unfolds. Thank you for being here. It truly means more than you know. If this story is already pulling at your heart, and I know it is, take a moment to support the channel. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's get back to the story. The castle had been preparing for the ceremony for 2 weeks before it happened. Black and silver banners, the colours of the Kingsley dynasty, were old as the bloodline and just as unyielding, hung from every window facing the courtyard. Noble carriages had been arriving for 3 days, filling the stables beyond their comfortable capacity, and filling the corridors with the particular noise of important people who wanted very much to be seen. Lords and ladies of the Embervale territories, pack elders from the northern reaches, advisors and their attendants, and the attendants of their attendants. The castle breathed differently under that kind of weight. Alexandra had noticed it immediately. The way the air in the corridors felt thicker, the way every servant moved with the brisk, careful efficiency of people who understood that being noticed right now was something to avoid rather than pursue. She understood that instinct. She had built her survival around it. That Alexandra had arrived at Castle Kingsley 2 years ago with a worn leather satchel, a reference letter from a schoolmaster in the Southern Territories who had been impressed by her precision with numbers and dates, and the practiced stillness of someone who had learned, from a very early age, that making herself small was the safest way to occupy a space. Margaret Winterbourne had been the one to let her in. Head of castle administration, a sturdy woman in her mid-50s, with sharp grey eyes that missed very little, and a manner of speaking that left no room for anything except the truth. She had looked at the reference letter. Then she had looked at Alexandra, really looked, the way very few people did. Then she had said, "Records room, dawn tomorrow. Don't be late." Alexandra had not been late once in 2 years. She kept the oldest castle records. She catalogued territorial maps, transcribed council minutes, tracked supply inventories that stretched back 4 generations. She was, by every official measurement, invisible. One of perhaps 12 people who worked the interior castle positions that required precision more than presence. The great ceremonies and councils and public reckonings of the Kingsley Court happened above and around her like weather. She kept the records of it all and attended none of it. It suited her. She had spent her childhood at the Embervale Southern Orphanage, a place that was not cruel so much as it was indifferent, which is sometimes a harder thing to carry. The headmistress there, a thin-necked woman named Delphine Thornfield, or had looked at Alexandra with something that was not quite dislike from the very first week. Not quite dislike because it was not personal. It was something more like unease. The way a person feels when they cannot account for something, and the inability to account for it makes them nervous. Alexandra had noticed it. She had noticed most things about people that they didn't intend her to notice. She always knew when someone was lying. Not approximately, not with reasonable suspicion. She knew it the way she knew when rain was coming, with the same quiet certainty in her chest, undeniable and arrived at without any clear path of reasoning. She knew when people meant the opposite of what they said. She knew when affection was genuine versus performed. She knew when the space between two people held something real or something constructed. She had learned, very early, not to mention this. The horses always came to her. The castle cats sought her out with an immediacy that confused their usual keepers. Small birds landed on windowsills near wherever she sat and waited. She had never thought of these things as significant. They were simply how things were for her. Small, strange consistencies in a life that had never offered her much by way of explanation. Bradford Kingsley first appeared in the records room doorway on a rainy autumn evening, 11 months before the ceremony that ended everything. It was nearly midnight. Alexandra was alone, working through a stack of old territorial maps that had been misfiled sometime in the previous century and were causing quiet administrative chaos. She heard the footstep in the doorway. Heavy, deliberate, while not bothering to be quiet, and looked up. He was not wearing his crown, not wearing a formal coat, dark shirt, collar undone, plain dark trousers that could have belonged to anyone. He was tall. She had known that, of course. Everyone in the castle knew the basic dimensions of the Alpha King, but she had not known, from the formal distance at which she had always observed him, that he moved like someone who had never in his life needed to announce himself, because every room he entered already knew. He stood in the doorway and said, "Is there a map of the Eastern Territories that doesn't require 3 attendants to unroll?" Alexandra considered him for a moment. Then she reached to the regular shelf, the one with the practical working maps rather than the formal ceremonial ones, and retrieved what he was asking for. As she held it out without standing, he crossed the room and took it, unrolled it on the work table, studied it for a moment, then looked at her. "You didn't bow, you didn't announce yourself." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face did something she hadn't expected. Not offense, not amusement, but something quieter than both. Like a person who has been handed something ordinary and discovered it is rare. "I think I've forgotten what it feels like," he said, "when someone doesn't." He sat on the corner of the work table, the Alpha King on the corner of a work table, and he was still there, an hour later. They talked about the map first, then about the territories it didn't adequately represent, then about the older records that told a more complicated story of those territories than the current political maps preferred. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, without either of them marking the precise moment, they began talking about things that had nothing to do with maps at all. He came back the next night, and the one after that. By the 3rd week, Alexandra had quietly moved a second chair to her side of the work table. Neither of them commented on this. The 11 months built themselves in the specific, careful way of things that neither party has named, because naming them makes them vulnerable to the things that could destroy them. They talked about his father, a man who had ruled with precise political architecture and died without a single genuine relationship to show for it, who had taught Bradford that love was a liability a king could not afford, and whose ghost Bradford had been arguing with ever since. She told him about the orphanage, about Delphine Thornfield's unease, about the horses and the birds and the thing she could do with truth that she had never found an adequate word for. He listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who had spent his entire life in rooms where listening was performed rather than practiced. "You always know," he said once, "when I'm saying something I mean versus something I'm saying because it sounds correct. Yes. Does it bother you that I sometimes say things I don't quite mean?" She had thought about it honestly. "You say them less than you used to." He had looked at her for a long moment. "I do," he said. "I notice that." The bond formed on a rainy evening in the 8th month. Bradford was reading aloud from a trade agreement he found tedious. She had mentioned once, weeks before, that the sound of someone reading aloud was the closest thing to safety she had ever known, and she had not expected him to remember. He was reading with the particular deadpan quality he applied to things he found formally absurd, and she was working through a ledger on the other side of the table, half listening, and the rain was coming down hard outside the records room's narrow window. He looked up mid-sentence and found her watching him, not at the ledger. Watching him. The bond clicked into place like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. She felt it, warm and deep and absolutely certain, settling into the center of her chest with the conviction of something that had always been true, and was only now being recognized. Bradford set the trade agreement down. He looked at her across the work table for a long, quiet moment. "We have to be careful," he said. His voice was low. Not afraid, careful, the way a person is careful with something they don't want to break. The council, the noble families. Not yet. I need time to find a way. I know. It will not always be like this. I will fix it. I know. Alexandra. He waited until she met his eyes. I will protect you. I promise you that. She had believed him. That was the part she would carry into the moors with her. Not the ceremony. Not the bond turning sideways. Not the letter she received the morning everything ended. She would carry the fact that she had believed him, that she had, against every instinct she had built over a lifetime of learning not to depend on anyone, chosen to believe him, that the bond had been real. She had known that too. She could feel the truth in it, the same way she felt truth in everything, not with hope, but with the deeper certainty that had never once led her wrong. That was what made the ceremony so much worse. She had known they were real, and she had believed he would find a way. And then the morning of the ceremony, a letter had arrived at her door. The letter arrived at 6 a.m. Alexandra was still in her night clothes when the knock came. Quiet, deliberate, the kind of knock that does not want to be overheard. She opened the door. The corridor was empty. But at her feet, on the stone floor, lay a folded piece of parchment sealed with plain wax. No crest, no mark. She picked it up, broke the seal, read it standing in the doorway with the early morning light coming through the corridor window at the end of the hall. The handwriting was Bradford's, or close enough to Bradford's to survive a quick reading, the slope of certain letters, the way the capital letters were formed, the particular spacing between words that she had seen across 11 months of notes and marginal comments left in the records he sometimes brought her. It said, I am asking you to leave the castle grounds before the ceremony this evening. Your presence will create complications I cannot manage publicly. This is not a goodbye. It is a necessity. She read it twice. Then she folded it, set it on the desk beside the door, sat down on the edge of her bed, and looked at the floor for a long moment. The specific, exhausted grief that arrived was not surprising. That was the worst of it. It was not surprising. She had always known, in the sensible part of herself, that the bond had never fully convinced that this was where things were going. A king could not keep a records keeper. A man with 400 political obligations could not choose a woman with no pack name and no bloodline and no single ally in any room that mattered. She had known it. She had spent 11 months hoping she was wrong. She dressed. She did her hair. She went to the records room and she worked until the bond shifted. And then she walked out through the servants' passage and into the night, carrying the dried sprig of moor heather Bradford had left on her windowsill 3 weeks ago, wrapped in a scrap of paper that read, For when things feel impossible, tucked into the deep pocket of her coat, carried without thinking, or in the way you carry the things that matter, even when you are trying to leave them behind. She did not look back at the castle. 3 floors above her, Bradford Kingsley stood on the dais in the great hall, with Celestine Silvercrest's wrist in his hands, and the applause of 400 wolves rolled over him like sound heard from underwater. Celestine Silvercrest was everything the Embervale court had ever wanted in a queen, daughter of the most powerful noble house in the territory. Silver blonde, composed, beautiful in the particular way of people who have been raised to understand that their appearance is a form of diplomacy. She had conducted herself throughout the weeks of preparation with a grace that was genuine rather than performed. Alexandra had observed her from a distance twice, and both times had sensed in her the particular emotional signature of someone doing their best in a situation they had not entirely chosen. She deserved better than what was about to happen to her, too. Bradford didn't feel the ceremony. He stood in it the way a statue stands in rain, present, unmoved, processing none of it. His hands went through the formal gestures. His voice said the required words, and somewhere in his chest, beneath the layers of political necessity, and 30 years of doing what was required, the bond between him and Alexandra shifted direction, and something in him went absolutely still. He felt her press shut against him the moment his mark landed. She had not cried. She had not sent anything through the bond that felt like anger or devastation. She had pressed herself shut, quiet and total, with the way he had only ever felt once before in his life, when his father died, and the castle went quiet in a way that felt like the world was holding its breath before deciding what to do next. He sent Remington Wolfhart into the Ashfang moors before the hall had finished applauding. Remington was his most trusted guard, a broad-shouldered wolf with a steady face and eyes that calculated distances very quickly and very quietly. He had served Bradford for 12 years. He was one of perhaps 4 people in the castle who knew about the records room, one of 2 who knew what the bond meant. Bradford said, "Find her. Don't bring her back. Just find her." Remington said, "Yes, sir," and went. Bradford stood through the reception that followed with the mechanical precision of a man who had been performing his entire life. He greeted every lord. He accepted every congratulation. He ate the ceremonial dinner without tasting a single thing. And at midnight, when the castle had settled into the particular post-celebration quiet of too many people in too small a space, he went to her room. The work was folded on the desk. The letter she had received was gone, taken with her, or burned. He had no way of knowing. Her worn boots were missing from beside the door, which meant she had walked into the moors in her good ones, which meant her feet would be cold before morning. On the windowsill, he found the dried sprig of moor heather was gone. He stood there for a long time. She had left in devastation, and she had still taken the one thing he had left her as proof that he thought about her when they were not together. And that small fact sat inside his chest like something sharp and gentle at the same time, cutting him and comforting him simultaneously, because it meant that she had not left with nothing. She had carried something with her. Something of him. He did not know yet what the letter had said. He did not know yet that she had left believing he had sent her away. He thought she had left in heartbreak, the way someone leaves when they have witnessed a thing they cannot stay to see repeated. The difference between those 2 things was everything. He spent the next 4 days doing what kings do when they are breaking inside. He administered. He met with advisors. He signed documents. He sat through council sessions with the attentive expression of someone listening carefully while hearing none of it. And on the 4th morning, Remington placed a folded piece of parchment on his desk without a word. Bradford looked at it. "What is this?" "The letter," Remington said. "The one she received the morning of the ceremony." Bradford read it. Then he read it again. Then he set it down very carefully on the desk, the way you set down something you are afraid of what you will do if you grip it any tighter. "Who delivered it?" Remington's face did something careful. "That took some investigation. Tell me, Audrey Darkmoor, Montgomery's daughter. She has unrestricted access to the private quarters. She serves Lady Preston in the East Wing, and the castle corridors in that section require no announcement." She knew Alexandra's schedule. She knew the timing. Bradford said nothing for a long moment. Yet the silence in the advisory room had the specific weight of a man who is very angry and is choosing, deliberately and carefully, exactly how to proceed with that anger. And the letter itself, written by someone who has studied your handwriting closely. Not a perfect imitation. If she had taken it to a document expert, or read it beside something she knew was genuinely yours, she would have seen the differences. But she read it at 6 in the morning, alone in a doorway. "Believing you had sent it." Remington paused. "It was designed to survive exactly that reading, sir. Not careful scrutiny. Just the first worst moment." Bradford stood. "I'm going to the moors. Sir, we haven't located her precisely. Then I'll find her. Get me a horse and my plain coat, not the formal one." Remington hesitated. "The council will schedule whatever needs to be scheduled." Bradford was already moving. "I will handle the council when I return. I will handle Montgomery when I return. Right now, I am going to find her." But before he could leave, Montgomery Darkmoor himself appeared in the doorway. Montgomery was Bradford's chief adviser, grey-haired, precise, composed with the particular composure of a man who had been making decisions on behalf of the crown for 3 decades, and had long since stopped distinguishing between his judgment and the kingdom's. He was 60 years old, and had served Bradford's father before him, and the weight of all that service sat on him like a coat he had worn so long he had forgotten it wasn't his skin. Now he stepped into the room with the measured pace of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared for it. Bradford looked at him. "Don't," he said. "Just that. Your Majesty." 6 weeks before the ceremony, Bradford said. His voice was completely level. That was, by now, the most dangerous thing about him. "You came to me with a preliminary council vote. You told me the council had concerns about my attachment to the records keeper. You told me they were preparing a formal charge. No pack name, no bloodline, no political standing. You told me that if I didn't agree to the Silvercrest match, she would face consequences she had no ability to defend against." Montgomery said nothing. "I believed you. I believed you because I had trusted you for 30 years. Because you served my father. Because I thought the one person in this castle who had access to everything was the one person who would never use that access to cage me." Bradford's jaw tightened. Was any of it true? Was there a council vote? Were there real charges being prepared? Montgomery was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The council does have legitimate concerns about—" Was there a vote? The silence stretched out until it became its own answer. Bradford looked at his oldest adviser for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "Get out of my sight. I will deal with you when I return. And understand, Montgomery, that whatever version of this you've been telling yourself, that you were protecting the kingdom, that you knew better, that 30 years of service gave you the right to decide what I was allowed to love. Understand that when I come back to this castle, I will name every piece of it in the Great Hall, in front of everyone whose opinion you have spent 30 years cultivating, and they will hear it from me." Montgomery left. Bradford followed Remington to the stables. The Ashfang Moors received him on the 19th dawn. Alexandra had been in the Ashfang for 3 days before she understood that she had no plan. She had understood this, technically, from the moment she walked out of the castle. She had no pack to return to. There had never been a pack. No family in the southern territories waiting for her. No name to trade on. No bloodline to shelter under. She had a worn leather coat, the good boots that were not quite right for moor terrain, a small amount of coin she had been slowly saving for the past 2 years, for no particular reason, except that saving things was a habit she'd built when she had nothing to save, and a dried sprig of moor heather in her pocket. The Moors were not kind. They were not cruel either. They were simply old and indifferent. The way things are old and indifferent when they have existed long enough to find most things interesting without finding any of them particularly surprising. A deep-rooted heather that came up to her knees in places. Grey skies that never quite decided whether to rain. The smell of wet stone and peat and something older underneath that. Something that had no name in any language she had encountered. That felt like the land breathing. She moved during the daylight hours and sheltered at dusk in whatever natural cover the moors provided. She foraged carefully. She had grown up near moor territory, and knew which plants were safe and which ones were optimistic suggestions. She did not make fires at night. Fires could be seen. She did not think about Bradford. when the bond pulsed, and it did pulse, stubbornly, with the insistence of a searching thing that had not yet understood it should stop searching. She pressed back against it with everything she had, and built a wall between herself and that warmth, the way you build a wall from whatever materials are available. In her case, from hurt, from the letter, from the specific image of him standing on the dais, with Celestine Silvercrest's wrist in his hands, while the bond turned sideways in Alexandra's chest. She stacked those images one on top of another like stones. The wall grew. Bradford's presence in the bond became something muffled, something she could almost ignore. She did not know yet that what she was doing was extraordinary. Ordinary wolves could not do this. She discovered the rogues on the third morning. She was crouched at the edge of a shallow stream, washing her hands, when she heard the footsteps. 3 sets, deliberately loud. Rogues didn't usually bother with stealth. Stealth was for wolves who worried about consequences. Rogues in the deep moors had generally concluded that consequences were someone else's problem. She stood. Her wolf rose with her, cautious, steady. Not afraid, but not confident either. She was not a fighter. She had never had cause or training for it. She had survived her life with stillness and intelligence, and the particular animal patience of someone who has learned to wait out most things rather than engage them directly. These 3 she looked at, and understood waiting would not be sufficient. They were large, all 3, different sizes, but all built the way wolves who spend their entire lives in moor territory get built. Which is to say, with the particular density of things shaped by surviving rather than being cared for. Or the one in the front smiled with the easy confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and found it entirely in their favor. Alexandra planted her feet. She did not shift. She stood exactly where she was, on the moor grass edge of the stream, and she looked at them with the specific stillness she had carried since childhood, the one that was not bravado, and not fear, and not quite anything the rogues seemed to have a category for. Moving through someone's territory, the leader said pleasantly. That usually comes with a cost. I wasn't aware, Alexandra said, that the open moor belonged to anyone in particular. It belongs to whoever's standing in it. She considered this. Then I'd say it belongs to me. The leader laughed. He had an easy laugh, the kind that wasn't amused so much as it was anticipating. He stepped forward. Alexandra did not move. She understood, with cold clarity, that she had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation passed the point of anything she could manage alone. Her wolf was present, but untested. She had no allies, no pack call, no political value that would make causing her a problem more trouble than it was worth. She had nothing except the stubbornness of someone who had spent her entire life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she had no standing, no power, no armor, and who had simply declined, on each occasion, to present as prey. The 30 seconds did not arrive. He came from the tree line on the western edge of the moor like weather, fast and quiet, and with the absolute efficiency of someone who has been doing this for a very long time and has made peace with every part of it. He was large, silver-haired, or faster than anything his apparent age had any right to produce. He did not say anything first. In the time it took Alexandra to register his arrival, 2 of the rogues were already comprehensively rearranged. The third, the leader, shifted fully. Jefferson simply placed a hand at the back of his neck with a grip that communicated, without any violence at all, that the fight was already over if he chose to see it clearly. The leader chose to see it clearly. All 3 rogues departed, with the particular rapid efficiency of wolves who have decided the moors are large enough to be somewhere else in. Jefferson stood in human form in the moor grass and looked at Alexandra with deep winter blue eyes, pale as frost and completely steady, and the expression on his face was the one she had been trying to name since the moment he arrived. Recognition. Not welcome. Not threat. Recognition. The particular quality of sight that belongs to someone who sees not just what is in front of them, but what it means. You held your ground, he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of someone for whom speech was something chosen rather than reflexive. Against 3 wolves you had no practical ability to stop. Do you know why? Because running would have been worse. Because something in you, he said carefully, does not know how to present as prey. That is not something learned. That is something inherited. He told her his name, Jefferson Emberfang, though she sensed, from the first moment, that this was the name he used, rather than the name he had been born with, and that the two were not necessarily the same thing. Come with me. Alexandra looked at him. She could feel, with the particular truth sense she'd carried all her life, that his intention was not harm. His emotional presence was unusual, deep and layered, like a very old book that has been read many times and holds the impressions of every reading. But not dangerous. Not to her. Why would I trust you? She said. Because I just dismantled 3 wolves to give you the option of not trusting me, he said simply, and because you are broadcasting pain across this moor from a distance that is going to attract something worse than what I just managed. You are not quiet, even when you think you are. Come. She followed him through the heather and the grey morning light, with the dried sprig of moor heather in her coat pocket and the ruins of a bond she was trying very hard to stop believing in. To Jefferson's dwelling was behind a waterfall in the deep moor, a place that required knowing exactly where to put your feet and in which order, which strongly suggested that the waterfall had not been chosen by accident. Behind the falls, a cavern opened into warmth and firelight, and the accumulated texture of a very long life. Shelves covered every surface, old books with spines in languages she didn't recognize alongside ones she did, dried herbs bundled with twine, carved stones with markings that were not decorative, objects whose age she could not estimate and whose purpose she could not guess. Everything arranged with the particular deliberate order of someone who knows exactly where everything is and exactly why it is there. Jefferson fed her without ceremony. Soup, bread, dried fruit, a cup of something herbal that was bitter and warming in equal measure. He said very little while she ate. She was deeply grateful for it. When she had finished, he said, "Tell me what you know about yourself." She told him. No pack, no family, the orphanage, Delphine Thornfield's persistent unease, the horses, the birds, the truth sense that she had spent her life treating as a private inconvenience rather than anything that required explanation. Jefferson listened. He sat across the fire from her with his elbows on his knees and his winter eyes steady, and he listened with the completeness of someone to whom listening is a serious activity. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The headmistress was afraid, he said. Wolves sometimes sense the presence of certain bloodlines the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. They cannot name what they sense. They only know it is something they cannot entirely account for, and the inability to account for it makes them nervous. What bloodline? He looked at her across the fire. What you have described, the truth sense, the bond with animals, the ability to read the emotional reality beneath what people say, these are not quirks. They are not simply strong intuition. They are the surface expressions of something very specific. He paused. Have you ever heard the word moon called? She had not. Jefferson told her. The word arrived in the firelit cavern behind the waterfall, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be spoken in the right direction. Jefferson said it without ceremony, without preamble, the way you say a true thing, simply and directly, because truth does not require decoration. Moon called. Alexandra said the word back to herself. Quietly, experimentally. It sat in her mouth like something she had always almost known. It is an old bloodline, Jefferson said, present in the earliest pack records, before the Embervale territories had the borders they have now, before the council system, before most of the political structures that currently feel permanent. Wolves born with the ability to perceive emotional truth. Not merely strong intuition. Not simply good instincts. Actual sight. The capacity to read the bonds between wolves as visible things, with texture and color and weight. To sense what is genuine in a person and what is constructed. And in rare cases, he paused, to hold the bonds steady under pressure, or expose what has been manufactured where something genuine should be. Alexandra's hands were very still in her lap. The pack councils declared them dangerous 2 centuries ago, Jefferson continued. The word used in the official records was destabilizing. A wolf who could expose truth had the power to dismantle every political arrangement, every strategic alliance, every carefully maintained fiction that kept a ruling class in place. The persecution was swift and organized. Within 2 generations, the councils declared the bloodline extinct. But it wasn't, Alexandra said. No. Jefferson's voice was even. It was hidden, scattered into small families across territories, and kept quiet across generations by people who understood that the safest version of a rare thing is an invisible one. He looked at her steadily. You are not the last, but you are the first in a long time who has been in a position where what you are matters very much. Alexandra looked at the fire for a long moment. She was thinking about the headmistress, about the way Delphine Thornfield had looked at her, not with the consistent dislike of someone who had formed an opinion, but with the persistent unease of someone who couldn't form one. Something about Alexandra that her senses registered, and her mind couldn't file. Like a sound pitched too high for conscious hearing that still makes you feel unsettled without knowing why. She was thinking about the horses. She was thinking about Bradford reading aloud from a trade agreement he found tedious, his voice dropping into something almost comfortable at the end, and the bond clicking into place like a door recognizing her. The bond, she said. Between me and the Alpha King, is it real? Jefferson studied her for a moment. What does it feel like when you reach for it? She pressed her eyes shut, carefully, cautiously, like someone opening a wound to check if it was healing. She reached for the part of herself that had pressed shut against Bradford for 3 days. Let her awareness move toward it. It was still there, strained, frayed at the edges, grey where it should have been gold, thinned by the pressure she'd put on it, and the distance between them and the grief she'd been using as a barrier. But alive, genuinely, stubbornly alive, pulsing with the low, persistent warmth of something that had not been manufactured, and therefore could not simply be switched off because the circumstances had become inconvenient. Alive, she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. A bond constructed for political purpose, or one that formed without genuine feeling behind it, would not survive the pressure you have applied to it over the past 3 days, Jefferson said. You have been pressing it shut with everything you have, and it has held. He paused, because what is real does not simply stop being real because you ask it to. Alexandra opened her eyes. The fire moved between them. He marked her, she said, not as an accusation, as a fact she needed to say aloud to see its shape. Yes, in front of 400 witnesses. Yes, with a letter telling me to leave. Jefferson said, very carefully, "Tell me about the letter. she told him, the handwriting that was close but not quite right, or the words that were arranged in the way someone arranged words when they wanted to be believed quickly and not examined carefully. The fact that she had read it at 6 in the morning, in a doorway, alone, in the first and worst moment of a day, she had already been dreading. Jefferson was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "I want to teach you something. Something you already know, but have never done with deliberate intention." "What?" "Look at the bond," he said. "Not with your eyes, with the sight you were born with. The one you have been calling instinct because you didn't have the right name for it. Look at the bond between you and the Alpha King, and tell me what you see." Alexandra pressed her hands flat on her knees. She breathed once, slowly. Then she let the sight come, not the way she had always let it come, sideways and uninstructed, and quickly looked away from, but forward and deliberate, like opening a window properly instead of looking through the gap. The world did not change visibly. The cavern was still the cavern. Firelight, stone, the sound of water. Jefferson across from her, winter eyes steady. But the bond appeared. It was like seeing a thread she had always felt, but never focused on directly, running from the center of her chest outward and away, through stone, through the moor, through however many miles currently existed between her and Bradford Kingsley. It caught the firelight, and didn't. It was gold at its core, but grey at the edges, strained in places, and in the places where she had been pressing hardest, there were thin sections, almost translucent, where she had worn it close to something that was not quite breaking. But it held. She could feel, along the length of it, the particular texture of something that had formed without anyone's permission, and was not interested in withdrawing its existence simply because the circumstances had become complicated. "Gold," she said. Her voice was strange in her own ears. Strained. Grey at the edges. But it's holding. A manufactured bond would have snapped, Jefferson said quietly. Bonds formed under political pressure, or built from convenience rather than genuine connection, they cannot sustain this kind of strain. Yours has been under tremendous pressure for 3 days, and it has not broken. Because it is real. He paused. Which means the question you need to be sitting with is not whether the bond is genuine. The question is why a genuine bond exists alongside a ceremony and a letter that seemed to say the opposite. Alexandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something she had not quite allowed herself to think directly until this moment. "If he truly wanted to let me go," she said slowly, "why does the bond still feel like him reaching?" Jefferson's winter eyes were calm, patient, the particular patience of a very old wolf who has seen 2 centuries of the world and has learned to wait for the moment when a person finds their way to the right question. "That," he said, "is the question." He began teaching her, not fighting. She was not suited to fighting, and he had enough honesty to acknowledge it rather than pretend otherwise. He taught her to use the sight with intention, or to read the bonds around her accurately, the difference between a bond of genuine loyalty and one of performed obligation, the texture of love that was freely given versus love that was offered with conditions attached. He taught her to hold her own bond steady under pressure rather than simply suppressing it, to press it quiet when she needed quiet, and to open it carefully when she needed to know the truth. She was a quick student, quicker than he had expected, though his expression was controlled enough that she only sensed it rather than saw it. The training lived in the space between grief, awe, and curiosity. She was still hurting. That was not a thing that training was designed to fix. The hurt of believing you had been chosen and then set aside. The hurt of a bond that said one thing and a ceremony that said another, was but the moon-called revelation had done something unexpected to her grief. It had made it three-dimensional, given it context. The headmistress's unease now made sense. The horses made sense. The truth sense that had served her quietly for 23 years without explanation had a name and a history and a bloodline that stretched back further than the current political order that had tried to erase it. She was not simply a records keeper who had loved someone she should not have loved. She was something old and specific and significantly more than the castle had ever known to account for. On the 7th day in Jefferson's Cavern, she sat by the fire after the evening training, and she opened the bond carefully, not all the way, just enough to feel along its length, and what she found surprised her. Bradford was searching, but not passively, actively, with the purposeful directional quality of someone who knows what they are looking for and has decided that the distance between them and it is something to be reduced rather than accepted. She pressed the bond quiet again, gently this time, not with the pain-heavy stones she had been using, but more carefully. She needed to think. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt the bond pulse once in response, faint, distant, searching. And for the first time since the ceremony, she did not press back against it with everything she had. She simply held it, let herself feel its warmth from behind the wall she had built. Let herself wonder. The castle noticed Bradford's absence. Castles always notice. They are, in their own way, living things, vast and complex social organisms in which the positions of the significant people function like tides. When a tide turns wrong, the whole structure feels it in small, particular ways. Conversations that stop too quickly when certain people enter rooms. Questions asked in careful, unimportant language. The particular attentiveness of a court that has learned to watch its king and is currently watching very carefully. The whispers varied, depending on who was doing the whispering. The ones closest to Bradford's circle said the king had gone after the records keeper, gone into the Ashfang Moors personally, without ceremony, 3 days after his own bonding mark ceremony. The ones slightly further out said the records keeper must have been something more than a records keeper. Enchantment was mentioned, influence, or the kind of language that surfaces when people have no adequate explanation and reach for a dramatic one. The ones who had always found Bradford's political choices too unpredictable said this was further evidence of a king too led by feeling to govern effectively. Celestine Silvercrest said nothing. She occupied the Queen's suite with the composed efficiency of someone who has been raised in a politically complex household and understands that what you present to a court in a crisis matters significantly more than what you feel inside it. She attended the meals she was expected to attend. She spoke pleasantly to the people she was expected to speak pleasantly to. She asked questions about the castle with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and received answers that were carefully managed to be informative without being illuminating. She read the carefully managed answers very well. Her primary useful skill, honed over 20 years of watching her father conduct the Silvercrest political business, was listening to what people weren't saying. The pauses, the redirections, the questions answered with questions, the specific texture of a room full of people who know more than they are saying and are watching to see if you know it too. She found Remington Wolfhart in the corridor outside the war room on the morning of Bradford's 22nd day in the moors. Remington was standing in the particular, attentive stillness of a guard who was not actively guarding anything and was therefore thinking about something else. Montgomery knew about the bond, Celestine said, not as a question. Before the ceremony was announced, he knew, and he managed it. Remington looked at her for a moment. His face did the careful thing it always did when he was weighing what the answer to a question might cost. He said nothing. "That's a confirmation," Celestine said, without particular heat, just as a fact being acknowledged. She returned to her chambers. She spent the rest of the day with the kind of quiet that belongs to a person who has decided that patience is a resource like any other. And she has been spending it, and it is running low. Bradford, meanwhile, was covering the Ashfang the way wolves cover ground they need to cover, with the long, relentless efficiency of someone for whom stopping is not currently an option. He had shifted twice since entering the moors. His wolf was faster and more suited to the terrain. He tracked by the bond when the bond was available to him, which was intermittently, unpredictably, giving him a direction and then going quiet again. She was shutting him out, deliberately and skillfully, which was itself information. Ordinary wolves couldn't do that with the thoroughness she was managing. Remington caught up with him on the 16th day, with a lead. An innkeeper at the Western Moor village who remembered a dark-haired young woman moving through 3 days prior. Still, composed, the kind of person who doesn't linger. She had asked about paths deeper into the moor. She had paid in coin without quibbling. She had moved on before the innkeeper had finished telling her what she'd asked. Bradford changed direction northwest. The days in the moors were not comfortable. He had brought a plain coat that was not warm enough for moor nights, which he was aware of and was declining to prioritize. He had brought basic provisions and his most reliable tracking instincts, and the letter Remington had retrieved, the forged letter that Alexandra had received, now folded carefully in his inner pocket, and the particular stubborn energy of a man who has decided the distance is simply a problem of insufficient persistence. He also had the truth now, the full shape of it. Remington had been thorough and quiet and patient, the way he was thorough about everything, assembling the picture piece by piece until the full architecture of what Montgomery had built became visible. The forged letter arranged by Montgomery, Audrey Darkmoor delivering it, the fabricated council vote, that which Remington had verified by quietly cross-referencing with 2 council members who had no idea why they were being asked, and were therefore perfectly honest about never having cast it. The ultimatum built entirely from materials that did not exist. Bradford had turned this information over in his mind for 19 days in the Ashfang. He had turned over the specific image of Alexandra at 6 a.m. in her night clothes, reading a letter in a doorway, reading his name at the bottom of words he had never written, reading that she would create complications, that she should leave before the ceremony, that it was a necessity and not a goodbye. He had turned over the fact that she had believed it, that she had folded the letter, dressed, gone to work. Murren sat in the records room for the rest of the morning, absorbing the specific grief of someone who had always suspected this was coming, and had allowed themselves to hope anyway. He walked northwest through the grey moor morning of the 19th day, and he wrote the letter in his head, because writing it in his head was something he could do while his feet were moving, and waiting was no longer something he was capable of. He would tell her the truth, all of it, in order. Not beginning with an apology. She deserved truth before she deserved comfort. He would tell her about the fabricated ultimatum and what it had cost him to believe it, and why he had believed it. Because Montgomery had spent 30 years proving himself trustworthy, and Bradford had been raised by a man who taught him that love was a liability, and those 2 things together had made him exactly as vulnerable as Montgomery knew he would be. He would tell her that the letter she received was not his. He would tell her that the bond was still alive, and that he felt it as something he was grateful for, not something he expected her to maintain for his sake. That it was hers to close if she chose. That he would stay outside whatever door she put between them for as long as she needed, and if she wanted him gone, he would go. He would tell her that he had been wrong, and that the specific kind of wrong he had been was the kind that cost someone else, and that he understood the difference between those 2 things. He shifted at the moor's edge as the 19th dawn came up grey and cold and ran northwest toward the only thing his heart still knew how to find. Jefferson sensed Bradford before she did. Alexandra was in the smaller cavern, the one Jefferson had moved her to 3 days ago, when the bond told her clearly that someone was covering ground in her direction with uncommon speed and purpose. When she felt Jefferson go still, in the way he went still when something was happening that required full attention. She felt Bradford a few seconds later. He was close. Closer than she had let herself calculate. The bond brightened along its length, even behind the wall she was maintaining, the way a room brightens when a door opens somewhere else in the house, and light comes in from a direction you weren't watching. She pressed her back against the stone wall of the smaller cavern, put both hands over the center of her chest. She did not go out. She listened, instead. Not with her ears, with the sight, turned outward with intention, reading the emotional presence moving through the mist outside the falls. Grief, carried quietly for a long time, the kind with worn edges from being lived with rather than set down. Guilt, yes, guilt with the specific texture of good intentions that had cost someone else, which was different from the guilt of deliberate harm, and she could feel the distinction. Fear, thin and persistent, the fear of a man who has found something real and is standing in the rain, hoping it is still there when the door opens. And beneath all of it, so steady she almost missed it in the tide of everything else. Love. Not calculated. Not managing itself for presentation. Simply present, the way a fire is warm without requiring explanation, or the way the bond had always felt from his side, like something that had never once consulted political practicality before arriving. She felt Jefferson go to the cavern entrance. She listened. Bradford's voice came through the stone and water, muffled but audible, not commanding, not demanding. Just arriving, the way he had arrived 11 months ago in the records room doorway, plainly, without announcement. I know she's here. I'm not asking to take her anywhere. I'm asking to be heard. Jefferson's response, even and unhurried. She doesn't want to see you. A pause. I know. And you came anyway. Yes. Another pause. She could feel, through the sight, the quality of Jefferson's attention on Bradford, that deep winter blue assessment that took the measure of things with the patience of 2 centuries. What he was looking for, she was not certain. What he found, she could feel even from the smaller cavern. A man who was not posturing. A man who had come 19 days through difficult terrain in a coat that wasn't warm enough because the alternative was being somewhere she wasn't. And he had decided that was worse. Jefferson stepped aside. She heard Bradford step through the falls, heard the sound of someone moving into the warmth of the main cavern. Then quiet. The crackle of the fire. The sound of Jefferson moving without urgency, placing things on the table. The particular quality of silence that fills a room when 2 people are in it, and one of them is deciding what to say. Bradford's voice again, low and without performance. Tell me what she received. The letter. Jefferson told him. The silence afterward had a specific weight. Though Alexandra measured it from the smaller cavern, the way she measured everything. By what moved through it. By what it was made of. What moved through Bradford in that silence was not anger. It was grief and guilt, arriving in the specific order of someone who has been turning a thing over for a long time and now has the last piece that makes the full picture clear, and the full picture is worse than he had imagined. She heard him ask for parchment. She heard Jefferson retrieve it without comment. Then she heard the long quiet of someone writing, only the waterfall and the scratch of charcoal on old paper. She sat in the smaller cavern with her back against the stone wall and her hands over the bond in her chest, and she waited. When the letter was finished, Jefferson brought it to her. He did not say anything. He simply passed it through the small connecting passage between the caverns and stepped back. Alexandra unfolded it. Bradford's handwriting, the real version, the one she knew across 11 months of notes and marginal comments, with the particular slope and spacing that the forged letter had approximated, but not quite reached, covered 3 sides of the old parchment. She read it slowly, then read it again, then again, then a 4th time. I am not going to begin with an apology. You deserve truth before you deserve comfort. He told her about Montgomery, about the fabricated council vote, about the ultimatum and why he had believed it, not making excuses, laying out the architecture of how he had been caged and why the cage had worked. He built it from what I gave him, my love for you, but my fear of what the world would do to someone without a pack name or a single political ally. He knew exactly where I was most vulnerable, and he placed the door right there. I said yes because saying no felt like I was choosing my own feelings over your safety, and you are not a person whose safety I was willing to gamble on. I was wrong, the specific kind of wrong that cost someone else. I know the difference between those 2 things, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I didn't write the letter you received that morning. I would have given everything I own to reach you before it did. The bond is still alive. I feel it every day, not as something I expect you to maintain for my sake. It is yours to close if you choose that. I am asking nothing from you. But I am outside this door. I will stay as long as you need. If you want me gone, say so, and I will go. I found, 11 months ago in a records room at nearly midnight, the only person who has ever looked at me like a man rather than a title. I have been arguing with myself about what to do with that fact ever since. I have made every wrong decision in that argument. I am done arguing. You are worth the cost of standing in the open. I should have understood that 11 months ago. I understand it now. Bradford Alexandra sat with the letter on her knees for a long moment. Then she put it down carefully, pressed her palms flat on her thighs, breathed once, slowly. Then she deliberately turned the moon-called sight toward the bond between her and Bradford with the full intention she had been learning to use over the past weeks. But what moved through it was not what a guilty man sends when he is trying to manage being forgiven. It was not performance. It was not the careful calculation of someone presenting their best case. It was exactly what the letter said. The grief with worn edges, the guilt that knew what it had cost, the fear that was thin and persistent and entirely genuine, and underneath all of it, steady as foundation stone, quiet as something that has never needed announcement because it is simply what it is. Love. Real and tested and unwilling to go out. She closed her eyes, pressed her hand over the center of her chest. She dismantled the wall, not all at once, stone by stone, the way it had been built, carefully, deliberately, one piece at a time. The first piece she moved sent a wave through her that she had to breathe through, her whole body going still against the cold stone of the cavern wall. The second piece was easier. The third was easier still. The bond, when she had the wall fully down, opened between them like a window being opened properly. She felt Bradford go still on the other side of it. She stood. She walked through the connecting passage. Through the main cavern, Jefferson was standing near the far wall, with his winter eyes carrying the expression of a man completing something he began a long time ago, patient and quiet. Through the cavern mouth, through the falls, the cold water soaking through her coat in the 3 seconds it took to cross, she stepped out into the mist. Bradford was standing exactly where the letter said he would be, at the base of the falls, in the plain coat that was not warm enough for the moors. the amber eyes finding hers before she had fully crossed the space between them. He looked absolutely terrible. 19 days in the Ashfang had taken the careful assembly of kingship off him entirely. His hair was longer. There was more dirt on his coat. The shadows under his eyes had the depth of someone who had not been sleeping much and had decided that sleep was someone else's current priority. She had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. Neither of them moved immediately. They stood in the mist at the base of the falls, the bond between them open and gold-warm for the first time in weeks, and simply existed in the same space, without glass or distance between them. He said her name. Just that. Just her name, in the quiet way he had always said it in the records room. Not as a title, not as a category, just as what it was, the particular sound that meant her, specifically. She crossed the remaining distance. She put her hand against his chest, not dramatically, just to feel, the way you feel something you have been afraid had gone. The bond surged warm and certain under her palm. "You're cold," she said. "It's a cold moor," he said. His voice was rough. "I brought the wrong coat. I know. I sensed it." Something moved across his face, complicated and relieved and grieving all at once. "I've been writing the letter in my head since the 4th day," he said. "Every version. Every way to begin it. You started with the truth," she said. "Not the apology. You deserved the truth first." She looked at him steadily. "You were caged. Yes. You believed the cage because he built it from the thing you were most afraid of." "Yes. You should have trusted me enough to tell me," she said, "before the ceremony. You should have come to me and told me what was being used against you. That was the mistake." "I know." His jaw tightened. "I know that." She held that honesty between them for a moment. Let him stand in it fully. Then she said, "The bond is real. I can see it now, clearly, with intention. I know what's real and what isn't." And it's real," she said. "That's not in question." He exhaled, a long, slow breath, like someone setting down something very heavy at the end of a very long day. His forehead dropped forward toward hers. "Come home," he said quietly. "Let me fix what I broke. Let me name it properly. All of it, out loud, in front of everyone who watched it go wrong." Alexandra was quiet for a moment. The mist moved around them, or the falls were cold behind her. The bond was gold and steady and entirely without grey. "I want Celestine Silvercrest treated with the respect she deserves," she said. "She came to this in good faith. She will be. She has earned it. I want Montgomery's actions named clearly, not managed quietly. Clearly. In the Great Hall," Bradford said, "in front of everyone, I want my bloodline named for what it is. Not hidden, not managed, named. I will stand in the Great Hall and say every word of it myself." She stepped back enough to look at him fully. The amber eyes were steady on hers, not performing, not calculating. Just present. Just Bradford, underneath the king, exactly as he had always been in the records room at midnight. "All right," she said. They returned to the castle together. They came back through the front. Not the servants' gate. Not the side entrance that preserved dignity through discretion. The front of Castle Kingsley, the wide stone approach, the courtyard with the Kingsley dynasty flags snapping in the morning wind, on a grey autumn morning, with Remington and 6 guards forming a quiet presence behind them, and Alexandra walking beside Bradford, not behind him, in the plain coat that was still damp from the waterfall. The courtyard stopped. A groom mid-task with a horse blanket went still. 2 kitchen attendants who had come around the corner paused in identical startlement. A minor lord who had been crossing toward the east wing dropped something, a document case, and spent a visible moment deciding whether to retrieve it before concluding, apparently, that it could wait. A Margaret Winterbourne appeared from the castle entrance in the time it would take someone who had been watching for this moment to move quickly from a position they had chosen for exactly that view. She crossed the courtyard with the brisk efficiency of someone who had things to say, and had already decided that ceremony was not going to slow her down. She pulled Alexandra into an embrace that said, without any words at all, that she had been watching and worrying and waiting, and all three of those things were now complete. Alexandra pressed her face into Margaret's shoulder for a moment, and allowed herself to be held. Bradford watched this from slightly aside, and his expression was quiet, and full of something that had no formal name in any language the Embervale court used. Margaret stepped back. She wiped her face, briskly. She produced, from somewhere that made no immediate architectural sense, a deep blue gown, the particular blue of winter sky just before dawn, with clean, simple lines and quality in every fold. "I've been holding this," she said, with the tone of someone who will explain nothing further and requires no further explanation, "for 3 weeks." Alexandra looked at her for a moment. "You knew I'd come back?" "I knew he'd go get you," Margaret said simply. "Dress. The Great Hall will be full by midday." The Great Hall was full by midday. Every noble family of the Embervale territories had received a summons. Every pack elder who had attended the bonding ceremony weeks prior. Every advisor, every senior house staff, every figure with a political stake in the proceedings of the Kingsley Court. But they filled the hall with the particular density of an audience that has heard something is about to happen, and has collectively decided they want to witness it. Celestine Silvercrest was present. She stood near the front, with the composed stillness of someone who had been waiting for this moment with the specific patience of a person who is no longer willing to wait much longer. She was beautifully dressed and entirely unrevealing. Montgomery Darkmoor was present too. He stood among his usual advisers with 30 years of careful political composure arranged around him like armor. He watched the doors. Bradford entered with Alexandra beside him, though the hall did not quite go quiet immediately. It did so in the particular rolling way of a large space in which awareness of something significant passes from person to person until the entire room has received it and elected collective silence. It took perhaps 12 seconds. Then 400 wolves were silent. Bradford walked to the center of the hall. He did not use the dais. He stood on the floor level, where 400 people could see him clearly, and he could be seen to be making no claim of elevation. He was in formal Kingsley colors now, black coat, silver at the collar, but without the crown. The absence of the crown was its own statement, and the hall read it correctly. He spoke without preamble. "What I am going to tell you today," he said, "is a matter of record. It will be written into the castle records, or witnessed by every person in this room, and the full account will be available to every pack elder who chooses to read it. I am not asking for reactions. I am setting the record straight." The hall was so quiet, it was almost possible to hear the moor wind outside the high windows. Bradford named Montgomery Darkmoor. He named the fabricated council vote, not vaguely, with specific reference to the 2 council members Remington had spoken with, who were present and who would confirm it. He named the forged letter, the specifics of its delivery, the way it had been designed to survive exactly the first and worst reading without holding up to any scrutiny that came after. He named Audrey Darkmoor's role, directly, without embellishment, or with the additional acknowledgement that she had acted on an instruction she had been given by a figure of authority she had not yet learned to question, and that this was a different kind of responsibility than her father's. He named the ultimatum built from false materials. He named what it had cost to believe it. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. It carried the same level, evidence-weighted quality of someone reading a record into the archive, which was, in effect, exactly what he was doing. setting it down permanently, without the option of later revision. Then he turned to Celestine Silvercrest. She came to this arrangement in good faith, Bradford said. She believed herself a genuine match rather than a political instrument. She has conducted herself throughout every part of this situation with grace she was never obligated to offer, and she deserves better from this house than she received. The Silvercrest family and this crown will conduct separate conversations about appropriate reparation, and they will be conducted with the respect that is owed. Celestine inclined her head. Her expression was contained and composed, but Alexandra, from where she stood, opened the sight carefully, and what she found in Celestine was not damage. What she found was the particular complicated texture of someone who entered a situation with genuine intention, discovered the situation was not what it appeared, and handled the discovery with more dignity than most people would have managed. There was relief in there. Something almost like gratitude, underneath the composed surface. Their eyes met briefly. No words. Just the acknowledgement of two people who had been moved around a board they had not designed, who had each, in different ways, found their own ground to stand on. Montgomery Darkmoor stood very still throughout all of it. He was removed from his advisory position at the end of Bradford's account. Not arrested, not condemned dramatically. Simply removed, clearly, permanently, with the specific weight of 30 years of trust being returned and found to be something other than what it had appeared. Audrey Darkmoor received measured consequence with room for growth, and left the hall with the expression of someone who has a great deal to think about and has chosen to start immediately. Then Bradford turned to Alexandra. The hall held its breath. She has no pack name, Bradford said, because no pack has yet been worthy of giving her one. The silence was so complete that the sound of the Ashfang wind against the castle's outer walls was audible. She carries a bloodline this territory declared extinct 2 centuries ago out of fear, and will now have the responsibility of learning to deserve. She is moon-called. The ability she carries is not a threat to what is genuine. It is a threat only to what is not. A court that has nothing to hide should have nothing to fear from it. He looked at her across the hall, just at her, in the way he had always looked at her across the records room work table, like she was the entire room. "She is my mate," he said. "My choice. From this day, she is your queen." The silence held for 1 beat, 2, 3. Then Remington Wolfheart began to clap. Not the measured, courtly kind. Not the polite applause that fills spaces and means nothing. Both hands, fully, the sound of a man who has been hoping for this specific outcome for a very long time, and has decided that the correct response is exactly this. The sound of a large man clapping with his whole heart in a stone hall carries considerably. Margaret Winterbourne cried openly. The apprentice beside her looked genuinely alarmed and uncertain what protocol applied. The hall followed. It did so in sections, like a tide turning. First the people who were closest, then those who were watching for permission and found it, then those who had decided that political calculation could wait, and something true was happening, and they were going to be present for it. The old stone circle stood at the moor's edge, just beyond the castle's western boundary, in the place where the Kingsley line had spoken its most serious truths since before anyone still alive could properly remember. The stones were ancient, rounded by weather, settled into the earth as if growing from it, arranged in a circle wide enough for perhaps 30 people to stand in comfortably. They were perhaps 30 people, the ones who mattered, not the ones who held positions. Margaret Winterbourne, Remington Wolfheart, his face composed and certain, several pack elders who had requested the courtesy of witnessing, Celestine Silvercrest, standing at the outer edge of the circle with the contained composure of someone who has chosen to be present because presence matters, and whose expression held something that was not grief and not relief, but something larger than either. Sir Jefferson Emberfang stood at the north edge of the circle. He had appeared at the castle gate that afternoon without announcement and without explanation, and Bradford had simply opened the gate. He was wearing the same plain clothes he always wore, and his winter eyes carried the expression of a man completing something he had been waiting a long time to see completed. The moon rose full and winter clear over the Ashfang. In Alexandra's moon-called sight, the bond between her and Bradford burned gold. No grey at the edges, no frayed sections, no strain. Just something genuine and tested, and entirely unwilling to be anything other than what it was. They stood in the centre of the circle. Bradford faced her. The old words were simple, older than the Kingsley name. 'Tis simple enough that they required no embellishment and survived no substitution. They had been said in this circle by every generation of Bradford's bloodline in the moments when a thing was true enough to be spoken aloud permanently. Bradford said them first. When his mark came, it moved through Alexandra not like possession, not like a claim being staked. It moved like recognition, like arriving somewhere she had always been moving toward, finding the door open and the light already on inside. She marked him in return. He exhaled against her shoulder. A long, slow breath, the specific sound of a man setting down something he didn't know he had been carrying until the moment his hands were free of it. "My queen," he said. Quiet. Complete. The way you say a true thing when no performance is required. She put her hand against his chest, felt the bond beneath her palm, gold and warm and entirely without grey. "My king," she said, and felt the word settle into truth the way real things settle, not with a dramatic arrival, but with the quiet permanence of something always having been true that has finally been spoken. Around them, the 30 people who mattered were quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they are inside a moment that is too real for noise. Jefferson Emberfang stood at the north edge of the stone circle, with his winter eyes carrying the expression of someone watching the end of something that should have happened a long time ago and is arriving now. Complete and correct and right on time, as it turns out, because the right time for a thing is always the time when it becomes possible for the first time. As he had seen 2 centuries of the world, he had seen a great many things. He was, for the first time in a very long while, entirely quiet. The records room at night smelled the same as it always had: old parchment, candle tallow, the faint mineral cold of the castle stone in winter, and underneath all of that, the accumulated particular quality of a space where serious things had been kept carefully and honestly for a long time. Alexandra was working late. She had been named Royal Archivist 3 months after the claiming ceremony, not as a courtesy title but as a working position with actual scope and responsibility, which suited her considerably better than an ornamental one would have. She had reorganized the records of the Embervale territories in ways that made the previous 2 centuries of filing look approximate at best, as in she had been working slowly and carefully on a separate private project, the documented history of the moon-called bloodline, assembled from the older archives that had recorded its existence before the councils had tried to erase it. The door opened at nearly midnight. Bradford leaned in the doorway without his crown, in a plain dark shirt with the collar undone, looking exactly like he had looked the first time he had ever appeared in this doorway 11 months ago, except that the amber eyes, when they found her across the room, carried something they hadn't carried then, not the careful wariness of someone who has been alone for a long time, and has forgotten what it feels like to be genuinely known. Something settled and certain and entirely at rest. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I never could," she said. He crossed the room, As she moved the maps she'd had spread across the second chair, he sat on the corner of the work table, because that was where he always sat, and some things were true across every version of a room. She set the kettle on the small iron hook over the candle cluster she used for warmth. In the comfortable quiet between them, he watched her move through the room with the ease of someone who knows a space the way you know a language, not consciously, not consulting rules, just inhabiting it, your body knowing where everything is before your mind bothers to check. He said, "Are you happy?" He always asked, not because he was uncertain of the answer, but because the asking was its own thing, a check-in, a small, regular offering of attention, a habit he had built since the moors and intended to maintain. Alexandra considered it. Honestly, or the way she considered everything. "I am home," she said. "That's better than happy. That's permanent." The kettle began to warm. Outside the records room's narrow window, the Ashfang moors lay under winter stars, quiet and old and indifferent in the way they had always been, carrying no particular opinion about the people who moved across their surface, except the occasional acknowledgement that some of them were interesting. Bradford reached across the work table and took her hand. The bond, in Alexandra's moon-called sight, burned gold all the way through. No grey, no frayed edges. Nothing left except something real, tested, and entirely unwilling to go out. He held her hand in the records room at midnight, and outside the narrow window, the moors were quiet under winter stars, and the bond between them held, the way things hold when they were always meant to.